Hello. So today we are going to talk about development. I hope everyone's doing all right. So this is a picture of my son Jack. You get to see lots of lovely pictures of my children today. My son Jack was, I'm imagining, probably about 3, and we were at the botanical gardens, and he was following my stepdad Jerry. So I just think it's a cute picture and shows, it illustrates the concept that children just naturally tend to imitate what they see. So, sorry, trying to get this a little better here. We're going to talk about developmental psychology. This is a branch of psychology where you study people during the lifespan. Dr. Rector is a developmental psychologist, and he kind of specializes in childhood development. And Dr. Allen is a gerontologist, and she specializes in elderly people and things that happen to them at that stage of life. Now, in this chapter, we could talk about development all through life, but we're not going to. We're just going to focus on infant and child development for this. So the first thing I want to talk about is how we do research in developmental psychology. There are 2 main research designs that we use. The first one of these is cross-sectional. Grab my water here. And in this type of research, we're looking at a bunch of different ages and having them do something, and we can compare how they do on a task at those different ages. So I might look at toddlers. I might compare them to 1st graders and then compare them to 6th graders, for instance. So the advantage here is it's pretty easy to do in that you can have these different ages and test them at about the same time. So it allows you to do a study relatively quickly. The disadvantage is you might get what's called a cohort effect. And this is where you see differences between generations. So if you talk to your grandparents, you might, maybe they lived through the Depression, and that really changed how they did things and thought about things the rest of their life. The fact that you all are living through this whole COVID situation, it might kind of change things from here on out. So we could, look at baby boomers, we could look at Generation X, we could look at millennials and see how they compare on certain tasks. All right, so that's cross-sectional developmental research. Then we have longitudinal studies. These are a lot more difficult to do because you follow the same subjects over a span of time, maybe even their lifetime. So the great thing about this is you don't have to worry about cohort effects or anything like that. Each participant can kind of serve as their own control. They're being compared to themselves over time. But as you can imagine, the disadvantage is it takes a really long time to do these studies, and you can lose track of participants. And so you might, start off with 100 and end up with 10 or something like that. So these are extremely difficult studies to do, but if they're done well, they give you a great deal of useful information. Okay, now we are going to move on to prenatal development. So this is before birth. And here is a lovely picture of myself when I was pregnant with my twin daughters. And I was about halfway through here. So can you imagine how big I was at the end? I was huge. When we talk about prenatal development, if you hear the term zygote, that basically means a fertilized egg. And we're talking about the first 2 weeks after that egg is fertilized. Embryo refers to about 2 weeks to about 2 months, so really early development there. And at this point, the egg is attached to the uterine wall. And then we get to fetus, and that's all the way from 9 weeks to birth. Okay, so just some terminology there. So how is the sex of the baby determined? Well, contrary to what people thought for most of history, and there's some pretty awful stories of kings who, had their wives beheaded because they weren't delivering a son. Well, it turns out it wasn't the mother's fault. There's my dog. It was the father's fault. So every egg has an X chromosome, all right? But the sperm determines the sex of the child. So the sperm might have an X chromosome or might have a Y. If the sperm is X, then the baby is XX. That will be female. If the sperm is Y, then the baby will be XY. That will be male. And this is just kind of a list of some various things that happen throughout pregnancy and at what time they happen. And it's pretty amazing how quickly babies form. So the spine about the 3rd week, the heart begins to beat at the 4th week, fingers and male sex organs are formed about the 7th or 8th week, female sex organs are formed about the 10th or 11th, fingerprint about the 12th week, when the fetus only weighs about an ounce. So it just gives you some kind of milestones, the time when different things happen. Oh, and sorry, and a full-term baby is about 40 weeks, which is actually a little more than 9 months. All right, what are teratogens? These are substances that can harm the baby. And there's a bunch of these, but we're mostly going to talk about drugs. And then I'll also mention lead and mercury and x-rays and things like that. So anytime a mother is pregnant, she is exposing her baby to pretty much anything she takes into her body. So any kind of drug is going to affect the baby as well. And for that reason, if someone finds out that they're pregnant, they really should just stop use of any drugs whatsoever, unless it's something that they are using for a medical condition. Some other things that can affect the unborn baby are, or even the baby after they're born, are lead, mercury, and x-rays. So if a woman's pregnant, she's not really supposed to get x-rays done, or her stomach should be protected from them. You've heard about lead that can be found in paint. So someone growing up in a poor environment where paint is peeling or chipping, and of course kids are always putting things into their mouths, they could actually be harmed by that. AIDS, so exposure to certain viruses can also affect the developing baby. And again, going back to this COVID thing, we don't know if there will be any effects. So a woman who's pregnant right now and gets the virus, is that going to have any effects on her baby? We just have no idea yet. All right, this is kind of a listing of some of the drugs of abuse, some of the drugs that people typically use, and the effects on the developing baby. Probably about the worst one out there is alcohol, believe it or not. So children of women who drink a lot of alcohol during pregnancy can have fetal alcohol syndrome, and that has certain characteristics, but the main ones are some abnormalities in kind of the face and head shape, some cognitive deficits, so they literally are not as able to do kind of mental calculations. It's harder for them to learn things. Their growth is retarded, so they're basically just smaller in a lot of different ways. And so some of these things might be low birth weight, small head circumference, which is what microcephaly is. They often have attention deficits. And then here are just some different things that can happen with some of the other drugs of abuse. So cigarettes or nicotine that inhibits oxygen that gets to the baby. A lot of these growth retardation things are kind of in common for these. Even something like aspirin, a woman should try to avoid that during pregnancy because it can cause some bleeding. And even caffeine, high doses can be harmful to the child. Now, I would say that, a pregnant woman is probably fine to have a couple caffeinated beverages a day, but that's probably about the cutoff there. And when I'm not talking about 2 venti Starbucks either. I'm talking about just 1 cup of coffee or tea. However, there are some things that we think of as good for us that can actually be harmful to the developing baby. So vitamins actually can be harmful if you take too much of certain vitamins. So for that reason, a pregnant woman should get on some prenatal vitamins that she gets from her doctor. Those are the safest. But even vitamin A, for instance, can be really harmful if it's given in large doses. And a positive control, that just means if you're testing out a new drug and you want to compare that drug's effects to some known effects, you could use something like vitamin A or alcohol. And in large doses, those always cause bad effects, basically. And you could test the effects of a new drug compared to those. Okay, whoops. And then this is just a picture of a baby that has fetal alcohol syndrome, and as that child develops. And you can see some of these facial abnormalities. So this area between the nose and the mouth is called the philtrum, and that's really smooth. The eyes are a little different, kind of a basic flattening of the whole face. All right.